I took the job because my kitchen counter wouldn't stay clear. That's the honest answer. Not because I've got some special background for port work, not because night shifts are my calling, not because the pay alone hypnotized me. It was the way the paper kept piling up, even after Lauren sorted it, even after I promised myself I'd handle it, even after I stopped opening envelopes because opening them didn't make the numbers smaller. The counter in our place is cheap laminate that's gone dull where it gets wiped down every night. There's a faint coffee ring that never fully fades. The overhead light hums when it's been on too long. The fridge clicks and sighs like it's tired of doing its job. Outside the window over the sink, Seattle rain tapped the glass in a steady little rhythm. Not dramatic, just constant. The kind that doesn't seem to fall so much as hang there and insist. The paper had its own weight to it, not in pounds, in feeling. A couple of envelopes were still sealed because I already knew what was inside. One had a bold due stamp in red. Another had a barcode and a list of line items in tiny print that made my eyes blur if I stared too long. There was a pharmacy notice with the same sterile font and the same "your plan covers" language that always ended with a number that wasn't enough. Finn stuff sat mixed in like it always did. A shipment slip for sensors, a reorder reminder, a printout from the clinic that Lauren had highlighted and folded into quarters so it would fit on the fridge under a magnet shaped like a dinosaur. Finn picked that magnet out at a thrift store because it looked like it had a missing tooth. He liked anything with a flaw. He'd point at it and laugh like it was a joke only he got. Finn was 8. People hear that and they think about scraped knees and lunchboxes and weird little kid obsessions. They don't think about supply chains. They don't think about insurance authorizations and shipping delays and the way your stomach drops when you realize you have 3 days of something left and the refill is processing. They don't think about how you learn to read the calendar like it's an enemy. We kept his stuff in a plastic bin under the kitchen table. Lauren labeled it with a Sharpie. Sensors, alcohol wipes, extra tape, backup. It was neat because Lauren made it neat, because when she can't control the bigger picture, she controls the small parts. She's good at that. I'm good at staring at numbers and feeling them press against the inside of my skull until I can't think about anything else. The worst part wasn't even the money. It was the timing. Everything had a due date. Everything had a call by and submit by and renew by. Finn had appointments that weren't optional because you don't skip the things that keep your kids steady. You don't push them back like you're rescheduling a haircut. There was a follow-up coming up in less than 2 weeks, and the appointment reminder was already sitting in Lauren's phone like a little landmine waiting for her to step on it. My hours got cut at the warehouse job in Tukwila the week after Christmas. They didn't call it a cut. They called it adjusting schedules to match demand. They said it like they were doing math on a whiteboard instead of deciding whether a family ate well that month. I'd been doing security work long enough to recognize the pattern. A supervisor pulls you aside and tells you they're tightening things up. Then overtime disappears. Then your paycheck shrinks. Then you're standing at your kitchen counter at midnight, counting on your fingers like you're back in middle school. I tried picking up shifts through a temp security outfit. I tried a weekend event gig. I tried saying yes to anything that came up. It all helped in small ways and failed in big ones. The bills didn't care that I was trying. The bills didn't care that I was tired. The bills were just paper with numbers that sat there like facts. That night, Lauren had gone to bed early because she'd been up with Finn the night before. He'd had one of those stretches where he didn't feel right, where his skin went a little too warm and his voice got too quiet. And it was nothing catastrophic, but it was enough to steal sleep from both of us. When you've lived in that kind of vigilance for long enough, your body starts waking up on its own, like it's trying to get ahead of the fear. I stood at the counter in my socks, the floor cold through the cheap vinyl, and I stared at the stack until I couldn't stare anymore. My eyes drifted to the screen of my phone, like it wanted me to do something instead of just stand there. I'd been scrolling job boards on and off for days. Not because I thought I'd find something perfect, because looking felt better than not looking. That's when I saw it. Night security position, Port of Seattle, terminal work, overnight. The pay number was bold, like it was proud of itself. It was the kind of number that makes you read it twice, not because you're excited, but because you're suspicious. It didn't match the rest of the world. It didn't match the kind of jobs that came up when you searched Security Overnight Seattle. I clicked it and read it all the way through, slow, like if I read it carefully enough, I'd find the trick. It listed the hours. It listed the location. It listed requirements that were normal. Valid license, clean record, able to walk and stand, basic radio communication, nothing about hazmat, nothing about restricted access, nothing that screamed danger beyond the normal kind that comes with working around machinery and water and trucks. I refreshed the page once, because I've developed that habit with anything that looks too good. Like it's going to vanish if you blink. It didn't vanish. It just stayed there, waiting like it didn't care whether I believed it. I applied in under a minute. I didn't rewrite my resume. I didn't tweak anything. I filled in my name, my number, my experience, and I hit submit like I was throwing something off a bridge and hoping it landed in the right place. The call came the next day. It was short, not friendly, not unfriendly. It was just a voice confirming I had a pulse and could show up. The guy didn't ask me where I saw myself in 5 years. He didn't ask about my strengths. He told me where to be and when. Tuesday, late, bring your ID, bring your boots, don't be late, I told Lauren at dinner, trying to keep my voice casual so Finn wouldn't pick up on the edge. Kids hear things. They don't always understand, but they hear. Lauren didn't smile. She didn't frown either. She just watched me like she was running a list in her head and checking boxes. Pay, hours, location, risk. Finn asked if I'd be home in the morning. I told him yes. He asked if he could have pancakes. I told him maybe. He shrugged like pancakes were a nice bonus but not a deal breaker. That's Finn. He rolls with what he gets, and it makes you want to be better than you are. The day of the shift, the rain didn't stop. It never really stopped. It just shifted between mist and drizzle like the sky couldn't decide how committed it wanted to be. I ate something around 6 because Lauren told me to. I drank coffee too early and then had to drink more later, and by 10 my stomach had that hollow sour feeling you get when you're tired and caffeinated and trying to pretend you're fine. I packed my bag with the same mechanical routine I always do. Charger, cheap snack, extra socks, a pen that actually works. You learn little things on night shifts. You learn that a dead pen at 3 a.m. feels like a personal betrayal. Finn was already asleep when I finished getting dressed. He'd had a decent day. One of the good ones. He'd laughed at a dumb video and told Lauren a joke that didn't land and laughed anyway. He'd done his homework with that fierce focus he gets when he wants to prove he can. Those days are gold because they remind you your kid is still your kid, not just a set of numbers and supplies and appointments. I went into his room with the hall light behind me, so I didn't have to turn anything on. The air in his room smelled faintly like clean laundry and the bubblegum toothpaste he likes. His nightlight cast a soft blue glow on the wall, and his stuffed bear was wedged against his shoulder like it was holding him in place. He slept with his mouth slightly open, his hair stuck up in the back where it always does, no matter how many times Lauren smooths it down. His breathing had that deep, even rhythm that makes you want to freeze time. I stood there longer than I needed to, just watching his chest rise and fall, listening to the house settle around me. I shut his door almost all the way, leaving it cracked the way Lauren likes so she can hear him if he wakes up. Then I went back to the kitchen to grab my keys, and that's when I saw Lauren standing by the counter. She had her arms crossed, not in an angry way, more like she was holding herself together. Her hair was pulled back in a messy knot. She looked tired, not sleepy tired, the kind of tired that lives in the face when you've been doing this for too long and you don't see the finish line. "You're really going out again?" she asked. "It's one shift," I said. "Ben, Don't take anything shady, she said. It's the port. It's security. It's not shady, I told her. She didn't argue. She just looked at me, and I could see in her eyes that she didn't believe in not shady anymore. Not when the pay was that high. Not when life had been teaching us that nothing comes for free. If something feels off, you leave, she said. Yeah, I said. There was a pause where neither of us moved. The rain kept tapping the window. The fridge hummed. The stack of paper sat between us like a third person in the room. Love you, she said quietly. Love you too, I said. I put my keys in my pocket and slung my jacket on. I didn't kiss her like in the movies. I just squeezed her shoulder as I passed, because sometimes that's what you do when you don't trust your own voice. When I opened the front door, the cold, damp air came in immediately, sharp and clean and wet. The parking lot lights outside made the rain sparkle in thin lines. My car sat under the streetlight with a film of water on the hood, and for a second, the whole world looked calm. Ordinary. That's the thing about a bad stretch. It makes you grateful for ordinary. It makes you crave boring like it's a luxury. I got in, started the engine, and the heater blew out air that smelled like old coffee and Finn's grape-flavored hand sanitizer. I sat there for a moment with my hands on the wheel, feeling the vibration of the engine through my palms. I thought about the stack of paper on the counter. I thought about the plastic bin under the table. I thought about Finn's steady breathing in the room down the hall. Then I pulled out of the lot and headed toward the port, because there wasn't another choice that made the numbers work. The drive down felt like every other late-night run I'd done for work, right up until it didn't. A 99 was slick with rain, the kind that turns lane lines into suggestions and makes every brake light smear a little. The wipers kept time in front of me, squeak-thunk, and the heater pushed out air that never got warm enough to matter. I merged onto I-5 and let the late traffic carry me, trying not to think about the pay number from the posting like it was something I could count on. I'd learned not to celebrate money until it was actually in my hand. As I got closer to the port, the air changed. Working water has a smell that's nothing like a beach. It's diesel and wet steel and old rope and algae, with something sour underneath that always makes me think of machines that never really shut off. The lights change too. Neighborhood streetlights try to make things look normal. Port lights don't care. They're tall and harsh and sodium yellow, and they flatten everything into the same tired color. The wet pavement reflected it back up, so the whole yard looked glossy and drained. I pulled up to the security gate at 11:58 p.m. and put the car in park. The kiosk was a little concrete and metal box with a window that had been wiped clean enough to see through, not clean enough to feel welcoming. A keypad stood on a post beside it, and a camera angled down like it was always judging you. I sat there with my hands on the wheel and watched my breath fog the windshield. Nobody came out right away. 2 minutes isn't a long time unless you're waiting for someone to decide you're allowed in. The rain kept ticking on the roof. Somewhere deeper in the yard, a truck idled, that low diesel rumble you feel in your chest more than you hear. Farther off, metal clanged once, then went quiet again. The port kept moving, but the gate stayed shut. At 12:01 a.m., the kiosk door opened. The man who stepped out looked like he'd already worked a full shift before he showed up to meet me. Mid to late 50s, stocky, built like someone who'd spent years carrying things. His security jacket sat on him like he'd slept in it. His hair was gray and pushed back like he'd done it with a palm once and never bothered again. His face had that dry, tight look of too much coffee and not enough water. He walked like his knees had opinions, not a limp, just a careful pace, like he didn't waste movement. He stopped at my window and looked at me without leaning down, without any effort to make this friendly. "You Ben Halstead?" he asked. "Yeah," I said. He nodded once and jerked his head toward the keypad. I punched in the code they'd texted me earlier, and the gate slid open with a mechanical rattle that sounded older than it should have. I pulled through and parked where the faded paint lines told me to. He was already walking by the time I got out. I grabbed my thermos, pulled my jacket collar up against the rain, and followed him into the yard. Up close, the place felt bigger than it looked from the road. Lanes of concrete cut between stacks of containers, 2 and 3 high. Every surface was wet and streaked. Forklifts moved in the distance, lights blinking, backup alarms beeping like irritated birds. The sound carried weirdly in the damp air, sharp from some angles and muffled from others. Beyond the fencing, I could see the water in dark pieces, shifting and patient. He didn't do a tour. He didn't explain the port. He moved with purpose and expected me to keep up. He took me along the main patrol lane and showed me the boundaries the way you show someone the edge of a cliff, by walking them close enough that they understand it without you having to talk much. He pointed out where the lane narrowed near the water side and where the inland side had heavier rail and more structure. He made sure I saw the difference. He also made sure I noticed there was a bolted metal box near the kiosk with a slot in the top, the kind that looks like it's meant for people to drop something in and never touch again. He stopped under a high mast light that threw a wide white circle onto the wet concrete. Inside that circle, everything looked washed out and flat, like shadows weren't allowed. Outside it, the yard fell back into yellow gloom. I felt myself settling there without meaning to. Night shift instincts. You find the best light. You anchor yourself to it. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out a laminated card. It was about the size of an index card, clean edges, a hole punched in one corner like it was meant to hang on something. No logo, no company letterhead, just 5 lines of text in plain black font. The plastic was cold when he held it out, and the way he held it made it feel less like paperwork and more like something you didn't want to keep touching. I took it. The card pressed against my palm like it had weight beyond what it was. "Read the card. Follow it word for word," he told me. I looked up at him, then back down at the print, trying to place it in the category of normal workplace stuff. Safety policy, site procedure, some weird port superstition that had become habit. Anything that fit inside a box I already understood. "What happens if I don't?" I asked. "Then you'll learn why the pay's like that," he said flatly. The rainwater slid off the kiosk roof and splashed into a puddle beside us, a small sound that felt louder than it should have. He didn't blink. He didn't soften it. It wasn't a threat exactly. It was just a fact he'd stopped being emotional about. He tapped his radio once, checking the channel like he was confirming something was still connected. "Curtis Lang on dispatch," he said over the radio. There was a half-second of static, then the calm voice of a man who sounded like he belonged to the equipment more than the room. "Copy," I said. He looked at me the way supervisors look at new hires when they're deciding how much trouble you're going to be. "Keep your calls short and clear," he told me. That was the whole orientation. No handshake, no welcome speech, no "if you have questions." Just the yard, the rain, the high mast light humming faintly overhead, and a laminated card that didn't look like any policy document I'd ever been given. He walked off into the yellow light like he had somewhere else he needed to be, and I stayed where I was under the mast light, reading the first line on the card and telling myself it was only weird because I was new. Workplaces collect traditions the way ports collect rust. People get hurt, rules get made, and after enough time the rule becomes a ritual and nobody remembers the original reason. That explanation fit. It was neat. It kept my head from going places I didn't want it to go. Under the mast light, I read all 5 rules twice, slow enough to memorize them, slow enough to notice how specific the wording was, like someone had learned each line the hard way. I let myself believe it, and I kept reading. I started the shift the way I always do when I walk into a new site. I made the place smaller in my head by learning its edges. That's the trick with security work. A yard like that can feel endless if you let it. Too many stacks, too many blind angles, too much water and open space and equipment moving in the distance. If you don't get a grip on the layout early, your brain fills in the blanks with worst-case scenarios, and you spend the whole night tense for no reason. So I built a loop. I kept the laminated card in my jacket pocket where I could feel it against my chest, like it was a badge I hadn't earned yet. I told myself I'd read it fully when I got a minute, but I already knew what it said, at least in shape. 5 lines, 5 rules. Enough to make a man like Dale speak in that flat voice. The patrol lane ran along the container stacks and the fencing that separated the yard from the water. Everything was wet. The concrete held shallow puddles that reflected the sodium lights in broken strips. In some places, the rainwater mixed with oil stains that had been there long before tonight, turning the surface darker and slicker. I walked carefully out of habit, not because I was worried about falling, but because a twisted ankle on an overnight shift will ruin your week and nobody feels sorry for you. I checked gates first. Chain link sections that were supposed to be latched stayed latched. Padlocks sat where they should. I touched a couple of them with my gloved hand and felt cold metal through the leather. I checked the hinges on a service door to a small equipment shed. I leaned in close enough to smell damp plywood and old electrical dust. Nothing was open that shouldn't be. Nothing looked freshly disturbed. No cut fence, no bent latch, no signs of someone trying to wedge their way in. I logged what mattered the way I'd been trained. Time, location, condition. The pen felt cheap in my hand, but it wrote. The paper on the clipboard was slightly warped from humidity, and my handwriting came out tighter than usual, like my body was bracing without asking my permission. The yard wasn't silent. It never is. Even when you're alone, you're not really alone. Somewhere out past the stacks, a forklift beeped in reverse, that tired, repetitive warning that starts to sound like language after enough hours. A truck engine coughed and settled into a low idle. Wind pushed through the steel like it was trying to find a crack. The rain made a soft hiss on everything, and every now and then it would hit a puddle in just the right way to sound like a footstep, which is why I don't trust puddles at night. Curtis Lang's voice stayed quiet on the radio. Minimal chatter. Mostly acknowledgments to people I couldn't see. The tone was calm, neutral, the way you talk when you've said the same words 1,000 times and you've learned that emotion doesn't help. It was comforting in a weird way, like the radio was proof that I was still in the real world. I did my first full loop and ended up back near the kiosk. The high mast light was visible from there, a pale circle in the distance. It pulled at my attention without me meaning it to. Stop point. Dale's word. I didn't know why he'd called it that, but I believed him anyway. You learn to trust small warnings from men who don't waste breath. I went inside the kiosk long enough to shake some rain off my jacket. The heater worked, barely. It blew air that smelled like dust cooking on an old coil. There was a folding chair and a clipboard holder and a half-empty box of paper towels. Normal stuff. The kind of minimal comfort every overnight spot has. The kind of place where you can drink coffee and pretend you're not alone, as long as you don't look too hard at the corners. I pulled my phone out to check the time, then stopped halfway through the motion. The rule about not touching the phone wasn't on the card, not directly, but my brain made the connection anyway. The rules were probably written by someone who knew exactly what people do when they get nervous. They check time. They scroll. They distract themselves. Maybe that's why it mattered. Maybe that's why Dale had looked at me the way he did when he said, "Keep it short and clear." I slid my phone back into my pocket and checked the cheap wall clock instead. It was slightly crooked and the second hand ticked louder than it should have. It read, 12:18 a.m. I had time. I stepped back out into the rain and started a second loop, slower. The first loop is for the obvious problems. The second loop is where you notice the small stuff, a broken pallet you didn't see before, a puddle that wasn't there, a door that looks the same but feels different in your gut. Halfway down the lane, I saw a woman walking toward me under the sodium lights. At first glance, I almost flinched because you don't expect to see someone moving calmly through a yard like that at midnight unless they belong. Then my brain caught up and I recognized a reflective stripe on her jacket, a badge clipped to her chest. Security. She was shorter than me, dark hair pulled back, face set in that practical, don't make this a thing expression that people get when they've been asked too many dumb questions. She carried herself like she knew where everything was without thinking about it. Marisol Vega. Dale had said her name earlier, like it was another piece of equipment I needed to remember. She slowed when she got close, not wary, just acknowledging another person in her space. The rain beaded on her jacket and rolled off. Her boots were scuffed like she actually used them. This was my chance to ask what I wanted to ask. Not the supernatural stuff, not yet. Just enough to make me feel less blind. "You ever seen this card before?" I asked. "Nope," she said. Her eyes flicked down to my jacket pocket like she could see the outline of the laminated card through fabric. "That's a lie," I said. I didn't mean it to come out accusatory, but it did anyway. The stress of the last few months lived close to my throat. Everything came out a little sharper than I intended these days. Marisol didn't get offended. She just stared at me for a beat like she was deciding whether I was going to be a problem or just annoying. "Ben, I'm trying to be nice," she said. "So be nice. One sentence." "What is it?" I asked. She exhaled through her nose, not a sigh exactly, more like she was letting something go. "It's a job you don't take unless you need it," she told me. Then she stepped past me like that was all I was getting, and it was. She kept walking down the lane, head slightly down against the rain, disappearing into the yellow light and the stacked metal. I stood there for a second, with that sentence sitting in my chest. It wasn't a warning about hazards. It wasn't a joke. It wasn't even advice. It was just a fact, and the way she'd said it made it sound like everyone here had agreed not to talk about the rest. I kept walking. I did another gate check. I touched another padlock. I looked for footprints in the wet concrete and saw only tire tracks and the scattered marks of forklift tines. Everything was normal enough that I almost relaxed, and that's when I noticed the yard had gotten quieter. Not silent, just quieter in a way that didn't match the activity. The forklift beeps felt farther away. The truck engine I'd been hearing went muffled like someone had closed a door between us. Even the rain sounded slightly different, like the drops were landing on something softer than concrete. My body picked up on it before my mind named it. The hair along my forearms raised under my sleeves. I slowed down without realizing it. My eyes drifted toward the waterline, and I forced them back, reminding myself this wasn't a horror movie. It was a yard. It was wet. It was late. I checked the time again, not with my phone. I found the mast light circle and moved toward it because my feet wanted to. Stop point. I didn't know what it meant, but I trusted the idea of it. If you're on a ship, you find the highest deck when something feels wrong. If you're in a yard, you find the best light. By the time I reached the edge of that pale circle, the clock in my head felt loud. I looked up at the light and listened to it buzz, faint and constant, like a hive. 12:38 a.m. I pulled the laminated card out and read the first rule again, slow, even though I already knew it. I didn't do it to remember the words. I did it to keep my hands busy. The rule wasn't written like a normal safety memo. It wasn't for your protection. It was an instruction, clean and exact, like someone had tested it and learned what worked. I slid the card back into my pocket and stood under the mast light. The rain hit my shoulders and ran down my jacket. The concrete inside the circle looked lighter, the puddles there reflecting a colder shade of white instead of the yellow around it. My breath came out thin and visible. I didn't touch my phone. I didn't check anything. I just waited, feeling stupid and tense at the same time. At 12:40 a.m., the buoy bell sounded. It didn't sound close enough that I should have heard it clearly through the yard noise and the rain. It wasn't loud like a ship horn. It was a simple metallic bell tone that carried across the water. 1, a pause, 2, another pause. Then it continued, steady, evenly spaced, like a person tapping a finger on a table. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. When the seventh hit rang out, it felt like the air held still for half a second, like the yard had been waiting to count with me. I didn't let myself think about what that meant. I did what the card told me to do because I'd already decided the worst thing I could do was improvise on my first night. I stared at the wet concrete in front of my boots. Not the water, not the stacks, not the dark corners. I planted my feet and started counting down in my head. 20, 19, 18. I kept my hands away from my pockets so I wouldn't reflexively reach for the phone. I kept my jaw loose because I have a habit of clenching when I'm stressed and then getting a headache later. I focused on the numbers like they were a rope I could hold. 17, 16, 15. The rain ran off my jacket sleeves and dripped from my fingertips. I felt the cold seep through my boots and into my toes. The mast light buzzed above me like it was annoyed. 14, 13, 12. Somewhere out in the yard, a forklift moved. I saw the blink of its amber light through the stacks. I heard the beep that should have come with it, but it came a breath late, like the sound was dragging behind the motion. 11, 10, 9. I told myself it was distance. I told myself it was rain. I told myself it was my brain misfiring from exhaustion. 8, 7, 6. A truck rolled by in the far lane, headlights sweeping across the metal like a slow scan. The sound of its tires on the wet pavement should have been steady. Instead, it came in pieces, like someone was cutting the audio in and out. 5, 4, 3. I didn't stop counting. I didn't look away from the concrete. I didn't reach for anything that would make me feel more in control, because I could feel that urge rising, that panicked need to anchor myself to a screen, to a time readout, to proof that reality was still lined up. 2, 1, 0. When I hit 0, the yard didn't snap back to normal, not right away. The sound didn't catch up like a video buffering and then resuming. It stayed slightly wrong for a few more seconds, long enough for my stomach to dip. Then Curtis's voice came through the radio, crisp and flat, cutting cleanly through the damp air like a blade through cloth. "Copy, Ben," Curtis Lang said over the radio. I hadn't called him. I hadn't keyed the mic. I hadn't spoken out loud at all. I just stood under the mast light with rain on my face and the laminated card pressing against my chest, and I listened to the port breathe around me like nothing had happened, while my brain tried to find a normal explanation that wouldn't fit. And for the first time since I'd pulled into the gate, I stopped thinking of the rules as workplace weirdness. I started thinking of them as instructions for staying in one piece. I didn't go back to the kiosk. I stayed on my loop and kept to the inland side, like the concrete had rules I couldn't see. You pick a direction, you follow your loop, you check the same points again, and you tell yourself it's all still real, because your feet are still making contact with the ground. The yard noise gradually lined back up the way it was supposed to. Forklift beeps matched forklift lights again. A truck's engine sounded like it belonged to the truck instead of trailing behind it like a bad dub. The rain stayed steady, and the wind came back in small gusts that pushed cold, damp air through my jacket collar. I told myself the weirdness had been a moment, a fluke, some odd acoustic thing off the water, anything. But the radio call kept echoing in my head, Curtis saying my name like he was responding to me when I hadn't keyed up. It didn't feel like a threat. It felt like confirmation that someone else was tracking the same invisible line I was standing on. I did another gate check, slower this time. I wrote down the times, more out of habit than necessity. The pen scratched across damp paper. My hands felt clumsy in my gloves. When I shifted my weight, my right knee complained, a dull ache from a life of standing too much and sleeping too little. I was aware of my body in that hyper-specific way you get when your brain is trying to stay anchored to something normal. Cold in my toes, tightness in my shoulders, the itch of wet fabric at my wrists. I didn't pull the rules card out again. I could feel it in my pocket like a warm stone, and I already knew where the next cliff edge was waiting. 1:15 a.m. I didn't have to look at my phone to know when I was getting close. The shift has a rhythm. The port has a rhythm. You learn to sense time by what the place is doing. A certain crew takes a break. A certain line of trucks slows. The radio gets quieter for a stretch and then picks up again. And in the middle of that, there's the private rhythm in your own body, the caffeine rising and falling, the yawns you swallow because you don't want to admit you're tired. I found myself drifting toward the waterside without meaning to, the way people drift toward something they're trying not to think about. The fencing along that side wasn't tall enough to feel like a real barrier, more like a reminder. Beyond it was a narrow strip of wet concrete, then the rail, then black water. The rain made the surface dimple and smooth and dimple again, like the water was breathing. Then I saw it. At first it looked like a normal oil sheen. Ports have them. Any place with this much machinery and fuel and old runoff is going to have a little rainbow slick somewhere. But this wasn't rainbow. It was dark and glassy, like the water had been polished, and it wasn't spread out in an irregular patch. It was a circle, a perfect circle, like someone had lowered a ring mold onto the surface and poured something into it. Clean edge, even thickness, no streaks, no drift. The rain hit it, and the ripples stopped at the boundary like the circle had its own skin. I stopped walking. My stomach tightened, not with fear yet, but with recognition. This was the second rule. This was the thing the card had mentioned in a way that sounded too specific to be a guess. The wind shifted, and with it came a faint metallic smell. Not strong, not like blood, more like old coins warmed in a pocket, pennies, copper, a smell that didn't belong out here mixed in with salt and diesel. My eyes wanted to go straight to the center of that circle, not out of curiosity exactly, but out of a reflex. When you see something perfect in a place that's usually messy, your brain wants to inspect the reason. It wants to find the trick. It wants to confirm whether it's real. I remembered the wording from the card. Don't look at the center, so I didn't. I kept my gaze on the edge of the circle, on the boundary where normal water met that glassy film. I counted my breathing. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Slow. Not because breathing exercises are magic, but because if I didn't control something, my body would start sprinting ahead of my brain. I took one step back, then another. I made myself do it the way it was written. No shortcuts, no testing, no leaning in, just a little. I backed away the distance I'd memorized, my eyes still on the edge, refusing to let them drop into the center like a coin into a well. When I hit the last step, I turned my whole body away, not just my head. That mattered. You can cheat a rule with a glance. You can't cheat it with your shoulders. I stood there facing the yard, the stacks, the sodium light, and I waited for something to happen. A sound, a splash, a voice. Anything that would let me label it. Nothing happened. For a few seconds, it was just rain and light and machinery. That almost made it worse, because the part of my brain that wanted to rationalize started talking again, trying to wedge this into a normal explanation, a discharge, a spill, a current, some weird surface tension effect. I didn't believe any of it, but I kept trying anyway. Then the pressure arrived. It wasn't a sound. It wasn't footsteps. It wasn't even that classic someone behind you feeling in the back of the neck. It was lower than that, broader, like the air itself had thickened around me, like the yard had gained weight. I felt it most in my teeth and in my ears, the way you feel altitude changes on an airplane. My jaw tightened on its own. The skin on my forearms prickled under my sleeves. I swallowed and the motion felt loud inside my own head. I kept my eyes forward. I didn't look back at the water. I didn't check the circle again. I didn't reach for the card. I just stood in the sodium light, letting the pressure sit there like an uninvited guest. and I waited for it to pass. It faded slowly, not like it was leaving, more like it was settling in somewhere I couldn't see. I moved on, because moving was still the only kind of control I had. By 1:40 a.m., the rain eased a little. Not stopped, just softened. The yard grew quieter again in that same subtle way it had before the buoy bell, but not as dramatic. More like the port was listening. The water side of the world felt closer than it should have, even when I was walking inland. I kept checking my route, gates, locks, fence line. The clipboard felt heavier than it should have. My shoulders ached from holding tension. Every time I blinked, I saw the perfect circle in my mind like an after image. Then, around 1:50 a.m., it happened. I was walking near the narrowing stretch of lane where the waterside rail sat closer to the edge, not close enough to be in danger, not close enough to matter. And then I heard my name. "Ben," the voice said. It didn't echo like a shout. It wasn't distant the way a voice across water usually is. It sounded close, like someone standing just below the rail calling up. And it didn't sound like a stranger. It sounded like Finn. Not a cartoon version, not a bad imitation. The exact little tone he gets when he's scared and trying not to show it, when he's calling me from the bathroom, because something feels wrong and he doesn't want to say it too loudly. That small, tight sound that goes straight under your ribs. My whole body reacted before my mind could catch it. My feet turned. My shoulders shifted toward the rail. My hand started to lift like I was going to grab the metal and lean over. It was pure muscle memory. When your kid calls, you go. "Finn?" My voice came out wrong. The second the word left my mouth, I wanted to swallow it back down. It wasn't a conversation. It wasn't him. The card had been specific for a reason. I'd just proven to whatever was out there that the hook worked. I didn't have time to hate myself for it. I forced myself into the rule like it was a harness. 3 steps back. I counted them in my head and made my feet obey. The concrete felt slick under my boots and my balance wobbled for a fraction of a second, enough to spike my adrenaline. Then I hit the landside rail and grabbed it with my gloved hand. Cold metal. Solid. Real. "I'm working," I said. The words felt ridiculous, like something you'd say to a telemarketer, like a joke. But I said them exactly, because this wasn't the time to get creative. The pressure in the air returned, heavier this time. My ears popped softly. The rain seemed to pause for half a beat. Or maybe my brain did. I didn't look toward the water. I kept my eyes on the yard, on the containers, on the harsh light that made everything look flat. "Ben, just look," the voice said quietly. It was still Finn's voice, close enough to make my throat tighten. And the way it said it wasn't dramatic. It wasn't pleading. It was casual, like he was asking me to look at a drawing he'd made, like it was nothing. That's what made it dangerous. It didn't sound like a monster trying to lure me. It sounded like my kid on a normal Tuesday. I felt my jaw clench so hard my molars ached. My hand tightened on the rail until the glove creaked. "No," I said. I didn't say anything else. I didn't add reasons. I didn't apologize. I didn't explain. I just refused. The voice paused. And in that pause, my body screamed at me to turn my head. Just a glance. Just to make sure. Just to confirm it wasn't real. That's the trap. The part of you that thinks seeing will settle your nerves, when in reality, seeing is the payment. The pressure shifted, like something moving in the air without footsteps. The smell of pennies came back, stronger now, threading through diesel and wet metal. My radio crackled. Static. Then Curtis's calm voice cutting in too sharply, like he'd been bumped. "Ben, say again?" Curtis Lang asked over the radio. I hadn't keyed up. I hadn't moved my hand off the rail. The voice from the water hadn't stopped, but it had gone quiet, like it was listening to the radio too. I didn't want to talk. Talking felt like opening a door. But Curtis was a real human voice, and ignoring dispatch on a first shift is how you get written up. My brain tried to split the difference. "Nothing," I said. The word came out clipped, not angry, just controlled, like I was biting down on everything else I wanted to say. A beat of static, then Curtis again, colder than before, like he was reading from a script. "Copy," he said flatly. The radio went quiet. The yard sounds came back in pieces, a forklift beep, a truck engine, rain on metal. Normal noise, but it all felt too far away, like I was listening from inside a box. The voice from the water didn't call again right away. It didn't have to. It had already gotten what it wanted from me. It had gotten my reflex. It had gotten my first mistake. It had heard me say Finn's name into the night like a prayer. I stayed with my hand on the landside rail longer than I needed to, staring at a stack of containers like it was the most interesting thing in the world. I counted my breathing again. In, out, slow. I let the cold rain run down the back of my neck and reminded myself of something simple and real. Finn was at home, asleep, under his blue nightlight, with his stuffed bear wedged against his shoulder. Lauren was in bed. The apartment smelled like laundry detergent and coffee and the cheap lemon soap she buys because it's on sale. That was real. Out here was the port. Out here was water and metal and a set of rules written like someone had learned them the hard way. I didn't move toward the water again. Not even a little. I kept my eyes forward, and when my legs finally trusted me enough to walk, I went back toward the mast light because I wanted the brightest place I could find, and because somewhere deep in my body I'd started to understand that the rules weren't about doing a job. They were about not giving the dark a straight line into you. I kept moving until my legs stopped shaking, and then I waited for the next rule to find me. It wasn't that I thought something was going to jump out from behind a container. It wasn't that the shadows looked like monsters. It was simpler than that. The port had turned into a place where attention mattered, where looking and listening and speaking weren't neutral acts anymore. I could feel the rules sitting in the background of every decision like a set of guardrails I hadn't known I needed. I kept my route tight and I kept myself busy. I checked what I could check. I logged what I could log. I made small, practical choices to keep my mind from spinning. Around 2:10 a.m., I found myself crossing a wider stretch of the yard where the high mast light didn't reach. The sodium glow out there made everything softer and darker at the same time. The water was off to my right behind fencing and rail, and I didn't look at it. I kept my eyes on the concrete and the painted lines and the reflective tape on my own vest when it flared in the light. That reflective tape was bright. It always is. That's the point of it. But out here, with the yard listening the way it was listening, the brightness felt like a beacon. I could see my own reflection caught in puddles as I walked, a moving strip of light that announced me. The rule came back to me with that same sharp certainty as the oil circle had. Flip the vest, hide the shine, don't give it a target. At 2:20 a.m., I stopped in a spot where no one would see me and think I was messing around. I turned my body away from the water side out of reflex, like direction mattered. Then I shrugged off the vest and flipped it inside out so the reflective side faced my shirt. It felt wrong. It felt like putting a seatbelt on backwards. But I did it anyway. I counted the seconds in my head, not because I didn't trust the rule, but because I didn't trust myself to keep time without reaching for my phone. The rain kept ticking on my sleeves. Cold seeped into my fingers as the vest fabric bunched at my shoulders. 10 seconds, 20, 30. And somewhere around the halfway mark, I realized the pressure had eased. It wasn't dramatic. No gust of wind. No sound dropping out. Just a subtle release, like someone had stopped staring at the back of your head. The yard felt less heavy. My ears stopped doing that faint pop and hold thing. My shoulders dropped a fraction without me telling them to. By the time I hit 60, I was breathing easier. I flipped the vest back the right way and kept walking. and the difference stayed. Not gone completely, but manageable. Like I'd just lowered the volume on something that wanted my attention. That was when I heard footsteps behind me, fast and careless. Not the slow, measured steps of a person on a night shift who's trying not to slip. These were loud on wet concrete, followed by a cough laugh and the clink of something metal against a belt. I turned and saw a guy cutting across the lane toward me, hood up, jacket half unzipped, moving like he owned the place even though he didn't look like he'd been there long. He was in his 20s, maybe early 30s, lean build, restless energy. He had that late arrival attitude, like showing up at all meant he was doing you a favor. Jax Hollis. I didn't know his name yet, but I knew the type. Every site has one. The guy who shows up loud because silence makes him nervous. The guy who cracks jokes because admitting fear would feel like losing. He slowed when he got close, looked me up and down, then glanced past me toward the waterside like he was casually checking the view. He pointed at my jacket pocket where the laminated card made a faint square outline. "What's that?" he asked. "It's not a joke," I said. I didn't say anything else. I didn't explain. I didn't sell it. I'd learned from Dale and Marisol that extra words were wasted out here. Jax grinned anyway, like he'd just found something entertaining. He stepped closer and leaned a little, trying to catch a look at the card, and I shifted my body to block him without making it a fight. He didn't like that. People like him never do. He took it as a challenge. He started talking, but I let it wash past me. I watched his hands instead. He had a small flashlight clipped to his belt, the kind everyone carries. His fingers kept brushing it like he couldn't help himself. The yard had gone quiet again, not fully, but enough that I could hear rain hitting the edge of a container roof. I felt that familiar thickening in the air, like the port was paying attention to us now, not just me. Jax didn't notice, or he noticed and decided to prove he wasn't bothered. He unhooked the flashlight with a little flourish and clicked it on. The beam cut through the rain and swept outward, fast, like he was scanning for something to laugh at. It hit the wet concrete, then the fencing, then the waterside rail. The second the light touched that direction, my stomach dropped. It wasn't because the rule said not to. It was because my body already understood there was something out there that wanted a line of sight. The beam was an invitation. "Jax," the voice said. It came from the water, same placement as before, low and close, like someone standing beneath the rail. It didn't sound like Finn this time. It sounded like Jax's own voice, the exact tone he used when he was calling to someone across a bar, casual and confident. The change hit him like a punch. His grin vanished. His eyes went wide and glassy for a second. The flashlight beam wobbled, then steadied, aimed more toward the rail without him deciding to do it. His head tilted like he was listening hard for the next word. His whole focus narrowed down to that one sound, like everything else had been turned off. "Don't answer it," I told him. He didn't look at me. He didn't blink. His mouth parted like he was about to speak anyway. The pull on him was visible, not in some supernatural glow, in the way his weight shifted, in the way his boots angled, one foot subtly pointing toward the waterside, like his body was choosing a direction his brain hadn't approved. I grabbed his sleeve with my left hand and yanked hard enough to break whatever trance he was slipping into. The fabric was wet and cold under my fingers. He stumbled a half step back, blinking like he'd just woken up. I didn't give him time to argue. "Walk back. 3 steps, I told him. I made it sound like a normal instruction, the way you talk to someone about to step into a forklift lane. No emotion, no debate. Jax's lips moved, and his voice came out low and shaky, not like the cocky guy from 30 seconds ago. "This is insane," he muttered. I didn't answer. I kept my hand on his sleeve and physically guided him as he took the steps. 1, 2, 3. Each step away from the waterside felt like pulling him off a magnet. When we hit the landside rail, I pushed his hand onto it the way I'd done for myself, making contact happen. I held him there for a beat, watching his eyes, waiting for them to stop tracking the water like it was a screen he couldn't stop staring at. The voice didn't speak again right away. It didn't need to. It had already proven it could say the right name in the right voice and make a grown man move. Jax shut his flashlight off like his fingers had finally remembered what they were holding. He kept swallowing, fast, like his throat had gone dry. I wanted to say a lot in that moment. I wanted to tell him to keep his mouth shut. I wanted to tell him he'd almost gotten himself killed. I wanted to tell him I didn't care if he thought I was dramatic. But talking felt dangerous. Talking felt like feeding the thing that was listening. So I didn't. I stayed on my loop, and I made him stay on the inland side of it for the next stretch, like I was babysitting a guy twice my size. He didn't complain. That cocky energy had drained out of him. He walked with his shoulders tight and his eyes too wide, like he was afraid he'd see something move if he let his vision relax. The rain kept coming. The yard kept working at a distance. Curtis stayed quiet on the radio, which somehow felt intentional now, like the fewer words we put into the air, the better. By the time 2:55 a.m. rolled around, my nerves had calmed into a hard, focused edge. That's another night shift thing. Eventually, your fear gets tired too, and what's left is this cold clarity. You don't feel brave. You feel practical. You do what works. You don't do what doesn't. I found the object near the edge of the patrol lane, just past a puddle that reflected the mast light in a long broken strip. It was small, half hidden against a concrete seam like it had washed up there. Wet, dark. The kind of thing you'd normally ignore because the yard is full of debris. But this wasn't yard debris. It was a little plastic charm on a frayed lanyard, the kind that comes off a kid's backpack or a cheap keychain. It was shaped like a cartoon sea creature, something with a stupid, happy face and big eyes. The colors had been faded by water. The lanyard was damp and gritty. It looked like it had been dragged through sound sludge and then placed carefully where I'd have to notice it. It hit me in the gut in a way I didn't like. Not because it was Finn's. It wasn't. Finn didn't have anything like that. But it was close enough to the kind of thing he could have had. Close enough to trigger that part of my brain that wants to connect dots that shouldn't connect. A kid thing. Out here. At 2:55 a.m., right when the rule said I'd find something. My hand hovered over it without touching. My mind ran through stupid impulses. Keep it as proof. Bring it home, show Lauren, show someone, make it real in daylight, throw it in my bag and pretend it didn't matter. Those impulses came from the same place fear always comes from. The part of you that thinks control is something you can hold. But the card had been clear. Don't take it home. Don't give it a root. I didn't pick it up with bare fingers. I used my glove, pinching the lanyard between thumb and forefinger like it was contaminated. It was colder than it should have been, like it had been sitting on ice. Water dripped off it in slow, thick drops that looked darker than rainwater. I walked it back to the kiosk like I was carrying something fragile and dangerous at the same time. Jax followed, silent, eyes flicking to the waterside every few seconds like he couldn't help himself. Inside the kiosk, the heater hummed and the air smelled like hot dust. The metal lost and found box sat bolted to the wall, waiting. The slot on top looked too small for most things, but this fit easily. I held the charm over the slot for a second, and for the briefest moment my brain tried one last time to rationalize. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it had fallen off someone's gear. Maybe a longshoreman's kid had been here during the day. Maybe it had washed in during a storm. Then I remembered the way the oil circle had held its shape under rain. I remembered the voice using Finn's tone. I remembered Jax's face when he heard his own name said from the water. This wasn't nothing. I dropped the charm in. It made a soft, damp tap as it hit the bottom of the box, and the sound felt final. I turned the key in the lock and felt the mechanism catch. A solid click, a real one, metal on metal, no wobble. The instant it locked, the air in the kiosk loosened. That's the only word that fits. It was like a tight band had been cut. My shoulders dropped without permission. The pressure in my ears eased. Even the rain outside sounded more normal, less like it was being muffled by something listening. I looked at Jax, and he looked back at me, and for the first time since he'd shown up, he looked like he understood he wasn't the loudest thing in this yard. "Lock it," I told him. He nodded once, fast, like he didn't want to risk saying anything out loud. I stepped away from the box and kept my hands in sight, resisting the urge to check my phone, resisting every normal habit that would have made me feel better. I'd learned something important in the last hour. Out here, comfort wasn't the goal. Out here, the goal was to make it to 3 a.m. without giving the water a reason to follow me home. The moment the clock rolled past 3 a.m., the port didn't throw fireworks. It didn't announce anything. It just loosened. That pressure I'd been feeling for hours, that sense of the air having weight, faded in small increments until I could breathe without thinking about it. The yard noise lined up clean again. Forklift beeps matched forklift lights. Engines sounded like engines. The rain sounded like rain instead of a blanket being held up between me and the rest of the world. It should have been relief. It was. A little. But relief has a shadow when it comes too fast. It makes you wonder what stopped paying attention, and why. I stayed near the kiosk after we locked the lost and found box. Jax hovered in the doorway like he didn't want to be inside and didn't want to be outside either. He kept wiping his palms on his pants without realizing he was doing it. I didn't say anything to him. There wasn't a conversation that would have helped. He'd either try to joke again to cover fear, or he'd spiral. Neither one made my job easier. So I went back to doing what I knew. I walked the lane, I checked the gates, I logged the locks. I stayed on the inland side like it mattered, because it did. I kept my eyes off the water unless I had to glance that direction to orient myself, and even then, I treated it like looking into a stranger's open door, quick, polite, and not an invitation. The first time I heard the buoy bell after 3 a.m., I froze. It was faint, almost soft enough to be imagination, and it came from somewhere that didn't make sense. I was deep in the yard, between container stacks, far from the water line. The sound should have been swallowed by steel and distance and rain. But there it was. One clean metal note, like a single tap, then nothing. My heart kicked up anyway. My body didn't care about logic. My body heard the bell and remembered the counting and the way sound had started slipping out of place. I didn't move toward it. I didn't react in a way anyone could see. I just stood still long enough to feel the wet cold settle into my shoulders again, then I resumed my loop like I hadn't heard anything at all. A little later, I saw the oil ring. Not out on the water, not along the fence line. In a rain puddle on the concrete, right by a painted lane marker. A shallow puddle, no wider than a dinner plate, with the sodium light reflecting in it like a dull coin. And inside that puddle, perfectly centered, was a small dark ring. Not rainbow, not smear. A clean circle, like someone had drawn it with a finger and the puddle had obeyed. I stopped with my boot right beside it and stared at the edge, refusing to look at the center out of pure habit now. The card didn't say anything about puddles after 3 a.m., but it didn't matter. I could feel the meaning anyway. The ring wasn't a threat. It wasn't trying to pull me over a rail. It felt like a reminder, like the port saying, I can reach you anywhere on this concrete if I feel like it. Marked. That's the word my mind kept circling. Not cursed, not possessed, not anything dramatic like that. Just marked in the way a dog marks a fence post, in the way a place remembers your footsteps after you've walked it enough times. I kept my hands busy and my thoughts small. That's how you survive something you don't understand. You shrink your world down to what you can control. Clipboards, locks, routes, one step at a time. Curtis stayed quiet unless someone called in. When he did speak, his voice was the same even tone as before. No concern, no questions, just short, clean acknowledgments. It was almost comforting, that steadiness, like he was proof that the world still ran on routine, even when it shouldn't. By the time the yard began to lighten, I'd stopped thinking in terms of hours and started thinking in terms of outcomes. Make it to dawn. Keep your head. Don't get curious. Get paid. Go home. The rain thinned as morning came in, not stopped, just eased. The sky shifted from black to a deep gray, then to that washed-out pre-sunrise color that makes everything look unreal in a different way. The sodium lights were still on, but the daylight started pushing back against them, flattening the shadows and making the metal stacks look more ordinary. That was the part that got under my skin. In full daylight, this place would just be a port, a work yard, 1,000 tons of steel and shipping schedules, and men in hard hats getting paid to move things from one place to another. It would look like a normal job with normal risks, and I'd know what it sounded like at 1:50 a.m. when the water said my name in my kid's voice. The first forklift passed close enough for me to hear the squeal of wet tires on concrete. A worker in a hooded jacket crossed a lane and didn't look at me. A seagull landed on a container edge and screamed like it was mad at the world. Everything was painfully normal. When Dale's truck rolled in, it was right on time, the way a man like him would do it. Headlights sweeping across the wet lot, engine idling with that low diesel rattle, tires hissing through puddles. I was near the kiosk, clipboard tucked under one arm, my vest damp, my gloves stiff with cold. Jax was gone by then, either sent away or vanished back into whatever corner of the shift schedule he belonged to. I didn't ask. The less I knew about other people's choices tonight, the better. Dale got out of the truck slow, like his joints were negotiating with him. He didn't look around the yard like a man worried about what he'd find. He looked around like a man checking weather. He took in the light, the lane, the fence line, the way I was standing. His eyes landed on me and held for a second. "You make it?" he asked. "Yeah," I said. "Good," he said flatly. He stepped closer and reached into his jacket without taking his eyes off me. He pulled out a manila envelope, thick, unsealed, and held it out like it was a wrench, like it was just another piece of equipment you handed to the next guy. I took it. The weight of it was unmistakable. Not coins, not checks. Cash has a density to it, a softness that still feels heavy. "That's for the night," he told me. I looked at him, then down at the envelope, then back at him. My throat felt tight, not from emotion exactly, from the way my brain was already doing the math even before I counted anything. How many refills, how many co-pays, how many weeks of breathing room? "Why so much?" I asked. Dale didn't blink. He didn't glance around to see if anyone was listening. He just gave me the truth in the same flat voice he'd used all night. "Because you didn't get curious," he said flatly. He let that sit there like a lesson and a warning at the same time. Then he stepped back, flicked his eyes once toward the yard, and nodded like he'd seen what he needed to see. There wasn't a "good job." There wasn't a "see you tonight." There wasn't anything that would have made this feel normal. He got back into his truck and pulled away like this was just a shift change, like the night had been nothing but wet concrete and paperwork. I stood there with the envelope in my hand and the cold morning air filling my lungs. The sodium lights buzzed overhead. The sky kept getting brighter. Somewhere out toward the water, I heard the buoy bell again, faint and lonely. And this time I couldn't tell if it was real or if it was just inside me now. I put the envelope inside my jacket and zipped it up like I was protecting it from the rain, like money could dissolve if it got wet. I walked to my car with my shoulders hunched, boots splashing through shallow puddles. One of those puddles had an oil ring in it again, smaller than before, and I stepped around it without thinking. Like stepping around a crack in the sidewalk. Like avoiding a bad luck sign, even if you don't believe in luck. The drive home was quiet. Morning traffic hadn't fully woken up yet, Just a few commuters and delivery trucks and buses starting their routes. The city looked washed clean by rain, reflective and gray. I kept the heater on high and still felt cold in my hands. When I pulled into our lot, the building looked exactly the same as it had when I'd left. That should have comforted me. Instead, it made me feel like I was carrying something into a place that didn't deserve it. Inside, the apartment smelled like lemon soap and laundry and the coffee Lauren had set up in the machine before she went back to bed. The quiet was thick. I could hear the fridge humming. I could hear the distant sound of rain on the balcony rail. Finn's door was cracked. The blue nightlight still glowed. I stood in the hallway and listened for a second just to make sure I could hear his breathing. I could. Slow, even, real. Lauren came out of the bedroom in a sweatshirt, hair messy, face puffy with sleep. She looked at me the way she always does when I come home from an overnight shift, like she's scanning for injuries and mood at the same time. "Did it go okay?" she asked. "Yeah," I said. The word came out automatic. It wasn't the truth, not really, but it was the only answer that kept the world from tipping over right then. If I said anything else, I'd have to explain why my hands were still shaking a little when I took my boots off. I'd have to explain why I kept glancing toward the window like I expected to see a perfect oil ring on the glass. I walked into the kitchen and set the envelope on the counter beside the stack of bills. I didn't open it right away. I just looked at it sitting there, thick and real, and I felt two things at the same time that didn't belong together. Relief, because the math finally worked. Fear, because I couldn't pretend I didn't know the price anymore. Lauren's eyes went to the envelope, then to my face, then back to the envelope. She didn't touch it. She didn't ask again. She just stood there, quiet, like she was afraid if she spoke too loudly something would hear. I washed my hands longer than I needed to, scrubbing the cold into my knuckles until they stung. I dried them with a paper towel and threw it away. In the trash, it landed on top of a crumpled receipt and a sensor wrapper from Finn's last change. Little pieces of our life, all of it measured and thrown away. I looked at the bills on the counter. I looked at the envelope. I looked toward the hallway where Finn was sleeping. I already knew what I was going to do. That's the part people don't like when you tell them stories like this. They want the clean ending where the father walks away, where fear becomes wisdom and the lights come up and the lesson is learned. They want the version where I choose safety and walk out of the port and never go back. But I've lived long enough to know that sometimes there isn't a noble option. Sometimes there's just the option that keeps your kids stable and your household above water. I took the envelope and slid it into the same drawer where we kept Finn's supplies, right behind the extra tape and alcohol wipes. I didn't do it because it made sense. I did it because it felt honest. It belonged with the thing it was for. Then I took off my damp vest, hung it to dry, and set my alarm for later that evening. Because whatever that place had done to me, whatever it had left on me like a fingerprint, it had also handed me a number big enough to let Finn keep being 8 years old without us panicking every time the calendar flipped. And once you see that math clearly, you don't unsee it. That's the part nobody tells you. The port doesn't just pay you in cash, it pays you in reasons.